right, well, thank you all for coming out. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this chance to get to come together as a student body and to listen to discourse on a very important issue. I just pray that it would not just be something that we walk in, listen, and then walk out, but it's be something that we would recognize the gravity of our role as being outdoing one another and showing honor and loving our neighbor. And I just pray that we would learn about important situations, that we would learn about you. I pray that you would give both speakers just humility and confidence, and that they would express what they mean to express, and that we would be able to listen and hear what they mean to say. And I just thank you for the freedom to come together and do this, and for the school that promotes ideas like this. Amen. All right, yes, well, welcome. I and Isaac, on behalf of the APP board, are very excited to welcome you all. This is important because as a campus, it's important to realize that we have the freedom to discuss important political topics and that we would actually take advantage of that freedom. A couple basic things about the debate. First of all, this is an actual debate. This is not something arbitrary where each of them picked a side, researched it, and did it as if they were doing a high school NCFCA performance or something of the like. It's something that they actually disagree on, and it's something where we just ask that you would listen and come away with your own perspective on it and listen for questions you would like to ask. Over the course of the debate, there'll be about 6 minutes for introductions, and then Isaac and I will take turns asking them a series of questions. They'll get a couple minutes to respond to the questions and then respond to each other. We'll go into a couple questions from the audience, so as you're listening, if you have questions you would like to ask, we will provide a chance where we'll take one or two from the audience and ask the gentleman who will be speaking, and then finally we'll close with 3 or 4 minutes of conclusions.
So yeah, I think it's important as we go into this debate. A lot of people in the United States don't know like the full context of what's exactly happening between the United States and Taiwan and China. And so without going into a lot of the details that you'll hear a little bit later from the speakers, I'd like to provide a little bit of overview of the situation. So in the wake of World War II and the civil war that occurred in China, there was basically kind of a division along the nationalist and the communist parties. The Nationalist Party went over to Taiwan, which is a small island off the coast of China under Chiang Kai-shek. Of course, Mao Zedong began to rule over China and create, the People's Republic of China that we know now today. In Taiwan, a lot of individuals in Taiwan still believe that they are the rightful China. They call themselves the Republic of China. However, most people on the international stage do not view them as such. However, the United States has considered Taiwan a strategic ally, both economically, militarily, and also as a democratic partner of one of the lone democracies in the Asian region. And so the question in the wake of what happened in Afghanistan, where the United States was humiliated on the international stage, is whether or not the United States is going to defend its allies like Taiwan if militarily provoked from China. And in recent news, there have been efforts from China, large or small, to kind of show military force in that region. And so the question under the Biden administration, the question for the debaters tonight, is what should the United States do if China actually follows through with those military threats? And so that's what you'll be hearing tonight. And I think that the goal of both Mr. Knox and Mr. Simmons is to provide insight and to kind of further that discussion. On the APP Instagram page, there is currently a poll where you can vote right now with whether or not you believe, just kind of approaching the topic on face value, whether or not you're in favor of the affirmative or the negative. We'll put up another poll at the end of the debate to see whether or not one of the debaters changed their mind. But with that, with no further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Knox and Mr. Simmons to the stage. So we'll begin with opening remarks from Caleb Knox.
Well, first off, thank you all for taking the time to come out here on a Friday night. Thank you to the APP board, Alan, and in particular Isaac, for just making this a possibility. And Caleb, thank you. You're a great friend and a man of a great intellect, so I'm honored to share the stage with you. I think a lot of us grew up playing the game of chess, right? You probably know the strategy. The goal is to go in and knock out the other player. It's a very Western game, even though it was invented in India. But in the East, there's a different game that's played. You might have heard of it. It's called Go. And in Go, the strategy, it's a little different. You see, the point of Go is not to go in and immediately wipe out your player, but to slowly and surely, using deception and hidden moves, to surround them until they have no idea that you had been plotting on doing so. Michael Pillsbury, a Chinese scholar on Sino-American relations, has pointed out that this is the best analogy to understanding how the United States operates with China, and he notes that this is the ethic that China derives from it. Don't let the enemy know your arrival until it is too late for him to stop you. People don't want the United States to enter a Cold War with China, but that misses what scholars have been telling us, that we were already in a Cold War with China. China has been on what is called the 100-year marathon, where the goal being to make Beijing the center of the world order. Now, to understand why Taiwan is important, we need to grasp and fully understand what this 100-year marathon is and why it matters to Westerners and Americans over here. You see, if you were to go back to China as recent as in the 1970s and tell people that you would be a global power, no one would believe you. But from 1970 all the way to 2010, China's export market has grown by 954%. The United States has been but a third of that. China in the next 5 to 10 years will overtake the United States as the dominant global market. Now, the United States, we need to be humble. The reaction can't be this angry nationalism. If another world economy is growing, so be it. But this is what we need to be careful of. China right now is using this newfound economic power to pivot and make the world more comfortable with an authoritarian regime. This is why the United States was blown away when in the United Nations, 70 nations signed a letter telling the CCP that they did a good job for human rights in Hong Kong. And if you've been following the news, you know that it's been anything but that. Now, many of you have probably heard or are aware of the Belt and Road Initiative. This, many people in the international community are telling us, is a Trojan horse for the CCP to set up bases all around the world in the name of economic unity. It's been a way for China to expand their power all over the Eastern world, and I'm not looking to diminish the economic benefits that have come from any of this. Nothing that we will be discussing tonight is simple and one-sided, but do not be mistaken. The positioning of all these ports is not for an economic benefit, but to increase the soft power of the Chinese communist power. Now, during much of the Western world and during COVID, we came to an interesting realization as a nation that China was lying about their statistics with COVID, but people in the intelligence community, they've known this for a while now. This is why, if you've been following the news, just a couple weeks ago, China launched a hypersonic missile. Now, the hypersonic missile, it goes up, it orbits the world, and it comes down, and this last test, it missed its target by about 12 yards. The United States had no idea that China had this capacity. The Joint Chief Staff leader, he said this is our Sputnik moment, a Sputnik moment that occurred just a couple weeks after the Pentagon came out and said that China is going to be increasing their nuclear arsenal by 5 times in the next 10 years. Now, everything I've been discussing, it's related to soft power. It's little deceptive moves like the game of Go that China has been on. But what happens when China accelerates? What happens when they get more aggressive? What happens when in the last couple months they've been doing a lot of invasion exercise on this little island that's about 120 miles off their coast? Taiwan. What happens when China invades Taiwan? And I'm standing on this stage and speaking to you all with conviction because I'm afraid that we don't grasp the gravitas and the significance of what occurs if China invades Taiwan and we idly don't respond. So I hope to develop in but a couple minutes 3 reasons why this is incredibly important. The first, this is an opportunity to curb Chinese hegemony. If China uses military force against Taiwan and we merely issue sanctions and use strong rhetoric, know this: we have given the Chinese party full right to use military action going forward. You can only negotiate if you have strength. But if China realizes that we won't defend Taiwan, we give them full rights. The heavens, they open up for them. Gone is the legitimacy of the international bodies that we have set up. Gone is our ability to bring China to the table. Know this, that I am not a war hawk. I do not agree that the United States should go spreading democracy to all 4 corners of the globe, but you should also know this, that if you want peace, that is only possible through diplomatic means. The second key important thing is actually an economic one. Times recently ran a piece that the most important company that you've never heard a thing about is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Co. The reason you've never heard about them is because they make 92% of our semiconductors. Semiconductors go with all of our technology, and the U.S. House Intelligence Committee released a report that said this would be a mission-critical part of the United States economy if Taiwan were taken over. And not only does this have economic impacts, no, the United States military, it depends upon the presence of semiconductors to make this go. If China were to eclipse Taiwan and get a hold of this, we have no idea the repercussions in both economic and national security interest. And the final issue, and I'll just touch on this briefly, democracy. Democracy is not good enough reason alone to go to war for Taiwan, but we should know this, that this isn't Vietnam. In Vietnam, no one wanted us there. In Taiwan, there are pictures coming out of people holding the American flag because it is a symbol of their dissension against the CCP that sits about 120 miles away. We are living in an era where the CCP is looking to export their model, and Taiwan is our opportunity to draw a line in the sand. I'm going to end with possibly what is the great paradox of this debate. There was simplistic appeal in not wanting war, and I agree with that. But if you do not want war, we need to be able to negotiate and use diplomatic means with China. That is only possible if we show them that we are willing to defend Taiwan. Keep that in mind as we go through the entirety of this discussion. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Knox. Mr. Simmons, you may proceed with your intro to the negatives.
I would like to echo Mr. Knox. Thanks to the APP board, and also would like to likewise compliment Mr. Knox. He's a great friend of mine, and I appreciate his sharp intellect and wit in all conversations we have, even if it's something like how you eat a hamburger. Russell Kirk, in echoing Plato, stated that the first great virtue of the statesman is prudence. Prudence, as defined by Aristotle, is right reason as applied to practice. And leader Edmund Burke, in constructing the conservative philosophy that we know today, stated that prudence was a moral rather than a complexional timidity. Burke, as one author put it, urged caution not out of cowardice, but out of humility. His conservatism was grounded in modesty and in recognizing that neither he nor any man had all of the answers. In the face of uncertainty, prudence dictates hesitating before making a drastic change. Before us today is a drastic choice and a drastic change in the affirmative. It would mean the reversing of the entirety of U.S. policy toward Taiwan and China for the last 40 years, departing all of our allies by declaring Taiwan an independent nation, which none of our allies that we have do, and committing to fighting a battle we will be defeated in over Taiwan, and engaging in a war that we as a nation do not have the willpower to fight. The decision is imprudential for the following reasons. The U.S. is militarily incapable of defending Taiwan. The U.S. has no clear red line for triggering such a war, and we have better options for deterring China in a long-term Cold War while maintaining the flexibility we need in decision-making as the world's premier superpower. Now, currently, there are only 17 countries that recognize Taiwan as an independent nation from China. The largest of those countries is Guatemala, and the rest are smaller South American countries and other second and third world nations dotted across the globe. Thus, in pledging military defense to them, we would be establishing their independence, or at least stating that we believe they are independent, a move that goes against fundamentally all of our allies' views of Taiwan. But secondly, the problem with defending, or pledging to defend, Taiwan militarily is there is no red line of when we will go to war with China over this. China currently encroaches on Taiwanese airspace and waters on a weekly basis, as Brian Clark, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, reports. And this question may seem not that important on the surface, but it is quite important in light of the last point that Mr. Knox made, which is this: if China were to arrange through many of their assets a sabotage of these chip plants, which has been one proposed and analyzed action that China could take, would we go to war for that? Would we go to war if China began encroaching upon islands that are closer to the coast than Taiwan? The absence of this line means that the U.S. is unable, through pledging to defend Taiwan militarily, to deter China, because a red line requires specifics. It requires, here is where we are going to use military force. And the U.S. has learned this lesson before in Syria, when President Obama stated that there was a red line of chemical weapons, and then we watched 1,000 innocent civilians be killed in a chlorine attack, and we were unable to do anything because the United States' willpower and military strength at that moment was not determined to be used, and ended up harming us greatly on the international stage. A similar case is before us today with Taiwan. If China were to begin to encroach upon Taiwanese land or airspace, would we go to war? And that is a question that has to be answered with specifics. The second is that the U.S. will lose a battle for Taiwan with China. The People's Liberation Army and Navy, which is China's main military agency, has the largest navy in the world, stationed near Taiwan. It has the third largest air force in the region, also stationed in the region near Taiwan. And as Mr. Knox pointed out, China has been conducting extensive exercises, including recently building a mock U.S. aircraft carrier to begin targeted practice on. Now, in 2001, the National War College conducted an analysis of how China might invade Taiwan. And specifically, they looked at avoiding what is termed in the intelligence community mirror imaging. Mirror imaging is when you project the way you think and the way you conduct military and foreign policy decisions onto another nation. And in assuming that China will strike with rapid force, much like we did at Normandy, we are committing such an error. China, as Mr. Knox pointed out, is rather engaged in a slow encroachment movement against Taiwan. And this attempt means that a red line will not be deterring, because they are going to push whatever line we give them up until the breaking point. And in 2001, the National War College said that China had a good likelihood of being able to take Taiwan if it was able to develop naval and air superiority near Taiwan. Well, in the last 6 months, China has built up substantially the 3 closest airfields to Taiwan, has constructed man-made islands with which to transport ships and troops toward Taiwan, and has also established a premier weapon with its hypersonic missile that Mr. Knox pointed out. And the final point I want to briefly touch on that we can come back to more is the U.S. does not fundamentally have the will to fight such a war now. General Douglas MacArthur stated once, "It is fatal to enter any war without the will to win it." And entering in a conflict with China right now over Taiwan would be such an error. The U.S. does not have the willpower, with the massive amount of social unrest, social upheaval, and inability to unify on almost anything, to go to war to defend a nation on the other side of the globe, that individuals here cannot and do not see a connection to. This is different than 9/11, this is different than Pearl Harbor, where there was a specific attack against the United States. But with Taiwan, there is something so far beyond us that there is no willpower in the United States to wage a full-scale war over it. And for these 3 reasons, we must not affirm this resolution. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Simmons. The first question is for Mr. Knox. What is the ultimate goal of the U.S. policy towards Taiwan? Proving ourselves against China, supporting Taiwanese democracy, furthering economic or military interest, or some combination thereof? You have roughly a minute to respond.
So I think one thing we have to understand, and this goes back to the point that I'm making, is China, they're on this 100-year march. The balance of power is shifting, and that is inevitable. But what the United States can do with humility and with gravitas is to make sure that as China grows, as they become a regional power, they do so safely. If they are to invade Taiwan, a military force, when the Taiwanese people do not want them there, what that is it's an endorsement that they can continue to do so going forward. The goal is long-term security for the geopolitical order. The United States has to be comfortable with, even if we are declining, even if the post-Cold War era of us acting unilaterally is over, we can act as the leader among a group of nations. Let me tell you, there is a new coalition being formed as we speak, a transatlantic partnership of people who are realizing what China is up to. It's incorporating Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Australia, and other nations who would normally be in support of China. But what is happening is people are realizing that there has to be order that transcends what is happening in the shift between China and the United States. So to bring it back to the original question, the point here is that if the United States does not respond, China is going to be able to grow in a way that is unrestrained from international limitations.
All right, Mr. Simmons, you have roughly a minute to respond.
So I think the first is that the contention is not over would the U.S. respond if Taiwan were invaded. That is outside the question that U.S. would respond. The question is rather, should the U.S. pledge military support, military defense? And that is a separate bounds. That is stepping across a line that the U.S. ought not to cross now. I think the U.S. certainly should respond, and they should respond, I think, even now in a way of not forecasting future military action, but rather through harsh economic sanctions, through looking to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative now, rather than deferring through a threat that ultimately we will lose if we fight a war over Taiwan 10 years down the road. I mean, China also is not exactly, well, they're on their 100-year marathon. They're running into errors with this right now. Right? They have an aging population. They have the problem of an economy that, while is manageable, is running into serious difficulties. They almost had a mortgage collapse a few months ago with one of their largest companies there. And so the question is not, should we respond? The question is, militarily, should we pledge response? And I would say no, because, for the reasons I laid out before.
Can I briefly respond on such
Yes.
grounds? So one thing we have to note about that looms large over the entirety of this conversation is the shift in what currency and what economic system people are using. Right now in Africa, that has the most vitality in the world, people are looking to China because China is going to invest in them. If we were having this discussion 30 years ago and Mr. Simmons said that we can use economic means, I would sit here and I would say, you know what, he's right. But that is not this world anymore. And we should be very clear that Mr. Simmons, I think, has done a very good job of pointing out that there is no red line, but we should not miss the irony that the status quo that Mr. Simmons is asking us to continue under is marked by what is called strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity is where we don't really tell people what we're going to do with Taiwan. It's kind of up in the air. But by being firm with China, we do set the red line, that if you engage in a maritime invasion of Taiwan, it's not up in the air, it's not up for question, it's merely a maritime invasion. If that occurs, the United States, acting in cohort with its allies, will not stand for this. This is the only sensible limitation that can be placed on them.
You may briefly respond to that if you'd like.
So I think the question of military response is a little bit different because so currently we do contract out and provide arms to Taiwan. And I have no problem saying we should supply them with greater missile systems, such as a Patriot missile system, or even help train their troops, as we currently what was revealed a couple months ago. The question is rather, should we pledge a military full-scale response to the invasion of China, or to the invasion of Taiwan, rather? And because the U.S. does not have the will to fight, the populace is not willing to wage a full-scale war. And while it may helpfully counteract present action, it is not a long-term solution to dealing with China's 100-year marathon.
So I think that this will kind of feed into the debate a little bit more, but a question for Mr. Simmons. You made a point that the United States doesn't have the will to fight. In 2021, Chicago Council survey data shows that when asked about a range of potential scenarios, just over half of Americans, majority, favor using U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China did invade the island. So my question for you, going back to the goal that Mr. Knox proposed of security of the geopolitical order, is if losing what has been called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the nation of Taiwan as a military asset, as the 10th largest economy in the United States, and trading partner with the United States, an ally on a similar level of South Korea and Israel, how is that going to maintain the security of the geopolitical order, even if it, prevents full-scale military conflict with China?
I think there's 2 points to that. The first, on the will question, I cannot respond specifically to that poll. I'm not aware of what that poll measured. However, I think rather the rise on both sides of the aisle politically across the United States of a retreat from an attempt to exert our values and our ways of life upon other nations through military action has been clearly shown. This is why President Biden ran on pulling out of Afghanistan and did so. This is why Trump ran on ending forever wars. So while individuals may in the abstract pledge military response to Taiwan, they don't vote that way, they don't believe that way. And we are under so much social unrest, individuals can barely stand to have a conversation with their neighbors about politics, let alone unify as a nation to fight a war that is not perceived as an imminent threat. And that is how I think the U.S. should start by responding, is through establishing that Taiwan is a friend of democracy, a friend of the free market, and that China is an enemy. Currently, the United States does not have regular government interactions and phone conversations with Taiwan. Trump actually started to reverse that a little bit, but never actually fully continued on with the practice. And that is, I think, one of the main things that should start in awakening the American people to it, but not beginning by pledging military support.
Mr. Knox.
What's very interesting about that statistic that you brought up is if you go back to 1984, only 19% of Americans wanted us to go to war with Taiwan. But if you ask that today, which they did, 52%. And what's interesting is I actually think Mr. Simmons, he diagnoses beautifully the problem with America. We've turned inward and we've turned against each other. But do you want to know why that happened? In 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed. And with that, we lost the presence of an external threat. Augustine, he commended Scipio for not burning down Carthage. You want to know why? Because he said if Carthage left the imagination of Rome, his people would turn inward and they would turn against one another. I think that if we actually saw the presence of an external threat, we would see the will of the American people harnessed like no other. And let me tell you something, do not discount the will of the American people. In 1776, 55 men of iron will met to sign a Declaration of Independence against what was the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Only 80 years later, in 1860, we said, you know what? Slavery is worth going to war for. 80 years later, we said that the forces of barbarism and Nazism were worth sending to troops in Europe. And 80 years later, here we are. We should not choose war. We should be prudent in all things. But know that prudence cuts the difference between bowing out and being bold when it is demanded of you. And I believe that we are blessed in being in one of those times where boldness is demanded of us.
I think fundamentally it's easy to look back in history and to ignore key historical events that led up to the cause of those examples cited. With World War II, we were bombed at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. did not enter and choose to go to war with Nazi Germany, and in fact would not have if Nazi Germany had not declared war on us in coalition with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Secondly, the recent example in Afghanistan, as alluded to by Mr. Bach, I think illustrates beautifully the fact that people commit to things often in rhetoric. For example, there were polls that showed 2/3 of Americans hated the decision to pull out or disliked the decision to pull out of Afghanistan after the result. But we stayed out, and now if you're to poll people, it's much less. The reason is because people often, when pushed with online clips and images of things, will commit to things verbally. But the action actually taken afterwards is often much less. And those positions often fade and wane. And this idea that we need to gin up a large foreign threat through pledging military defense to Taiwan is simply imprudent. It's foolish. Just because an external force has unified America before, when coming onto our soil, like the example of 9/11, does not mean that we ought to declare Taiwan as the red line that we will send our troops to die for. And it is fundamentally erroneous to take an example such as Nazi Germany, where we were bombed at Pearl Harbor, to take the Civil War, where we literally were torn apart as a nation, and that was kicked off by the bombing or the shooting of Fort Sumter, and then to claim that today, pledging now to send troops to Taiwan is an acceptable response.
Mr. Knox, moving to the strategic ambiguity point that Mr. Simmons referenced in his opening remarks, which is kind of the term of art for the current way that we're dealing with China in relation to the one China policy, where back in the 1970s under the Nixon communique, where he said that there was one China and Taiwan as part of it, but he didn't really say where China was, in Taiwan or in the mainland. So my question for you is, should the United States officially recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign nation and ditch its one China policy as established in 1979? Or does strategic ambiguity give the U.S. greater flexibility and therefore strength?
No, this is a false conflation. I believe that this is a defensive war. In no way do I suggest that we should say that Taiwan is a sovereign nation. As I said, the reason that we're defending Taiwan is a defensive posture against the growth of China. But I think the strategic ambiguity point is very good. It doesn't work for a simple reason that everyone in this room knows. You can't negotiate from a position of weakness. Now, as you pointed out, Mr. Bach, the reason that we adopted strategic ambiguity back in the 1970s was because this Communist Party was going through a series of reform. And Americans thought, okay, hold on. Maybe China is actually becoming more liberal and less communist. Because they didn't really know what China was doing, they said, let's be ambiguous. So if they become worse, we can change our position. But if they become more liberal, we can be all buddy-buddy with them. This isn't that China anymore. This is Xi Jinping's China, and we know that they did not become more liberal. We know the party lines got more cracked down. We're dealing with a policy that is the hangover of the 1970s over fundamentally different conditions.
Well, I think the first is that I agree that strategic ambiguity is not the preferable position, and that we should adapt and change to that. I think rather we ought to pursue a policy that's been called strategic coherence, where through stating clearly what we believe and why about China's actions, about their human rights abuses, and about how Taiwan is a friend to, as I mentioned before, democracy and free markets, we do begin to combat them in a more ready way. But I think fundamentally the question of Taiwan recognizing its independence is actually quite important, because there's a reason that you don't want to declare they're independent right now. And that's because not only would it provoke China to further military action that the U.S. does not desire, but it is rather goes against the core of what our allies are fighting for currently. We are fighting to keep a unified China. That's why we've had that policy for 40 years, despite the human rights abuses we've known. And it is quite easy to abstractly pledge military defense, but then to defer on the question of independence. Because it doesn't require any commitment. It's easy to commit to military defense when it's not being utilized now. It's easy to commit military defense when you're not currently being attacked. And it's much easier to commit that when you are. And rather, the question is not, should we commit military defense right now, but rather, how do we prepare the American people for if that time arises where it is just and proportional to the threat, that they are willing to stand with it? Because right now, they are fundamentally not.
Would I be able to briefly respond? Okay.
Sure.
Perhaps I'm not being clear. I just want to make this abundantly obvious. I'm not for Taiwan independence. These are two separate issues. One of them is offensive and unnecessary. The other is defensive and prudent. To defend Taiwan is merely to say, if China acts in a way that is militaristic in their growth, we are not for that. We're not going out of our way to just declare Taiwan a state. I'm not advocating for that. That's merely and I think this debate matters very less. In the real world, no one is advocating that Taiwan be called a state, but people are very seriously saying that we should define Taiwan. So that bifurcation can be made.
Yes, Mr. Simmons, you were arguing from a position of strategic coherence, but even in your introductory statements, you said that because the issue is somewhat out of sight, out of mind, because we don't have any connection to the individuals in Taiwan, therefore Americans are becoming more apathetic towards it. If the statistic of the Chicago Council survey saying that 52% of Americans are interested, if Mr. Knox's point stands, and Americans are showing a vested interest in what's going on, does your position change on whether or not we should be arguing from a place of strategic coherence?
I think 2 points on that. The first is the American people will commit to lots of things they don't actually support in action. This is why things such as universal medical care and other such policy positions that are not enacted because they are too radical for the American populace in action will be committed to in words. A majority of American people also support limiting or abolishing student debt. That's not enacted in policy either, because there's a big difference between rhetoric and action. And that's the fundamental, I think, distinction that's being drawn out here, too. Is rhetorically it is easy to declare that we would militarily defend China. It's very hard to give specifics on when we would do that, how we would do that, what the battle would look like. And those are the nuances that actually impact this issue. With passionate rhetoric, we can talk about how valuable Taiwan is. But in the specifics of how we carry out that defense is where we find out that policy is foolish. It is foolish to pledge military defense to an island that we will lose if we fight over, to an island that the American people will not support a war over. America just got out of wars. Like, that is the big action that just occurred, and because the American people actually support that. They don't support defending Taiwan, which we have a much less of a connection to than we had to the Middle East, where terrorists were coming literally to our borders to attack.
Response.
You want to know why we'd probably lose a war right now if we went and defended Taiwan? It's because of strategic ambiguity. We have not prepared in the ways that we need to defend China. This is, I told you, this would be the great paradox of this debate. That by pledging support to China, what we do is we put out the specific nuances that Mr. Simmons is looking for. Here's the first thing we can do. The biggest problem right now that America is facing is a logistical one. If Taiwan is invaded right now, there's very little that we could do. But let's say right now we pledge support to Taiwan. Well, the first thing would happen is we'd send F-22s over to Japan. That, one, deters China. China's going to be less likely to go to war if they know that an American presence is there. There's other things we can do that we just in the last couple weeks signed a deal with Australia to put nuclear subs in that area, AUKUS it was called. And what I'm saying is if we exit strategic ambiguity, make clear what we will be doing, that is how Taiwan becomes more sensible as a military consideration. And very briefly, if I may say, there is a misconception about Taiwan that it would easily be smoked. We should know this, that over 2/3 of Taiwan's islands cannot even be invaded upon because it is all, you know those beautiful pictures from California where it's the cliffs right up on the water? It's that in Taiwan, except the problem with Taiwan is that its weather is terrible, which means only 3 months out of the year an invasion is possible. Taiwan would not fall with ease, and I think we are doing ourselves a disfavor by saying that they would.
So one question to Mr. Knox, and I think that you'll have an opportunity to respond to it. We'll feed right into the discussion. If I'm hearing both of y'all clearly, it sounds like you agree on the point that there should be a policy of strategic clarity and cohesiveness as opposed to ambiguity. It just looks different on either side of the debate. So my question for you, Mr. Knox, is if you believe that we should, move planes to Japan to be clear and consistent with our policy and show a disposition of military force, where is this red line that Mr. Simmons asks you for? Where is the line? Where are the specifics? Sure, we can pledge military support, but when does that actually become action? Because I think that's his main concern on the other side of the aisle.
Yeah, I said this from the beginning. It's a maritime invasion. China was to invade the mainland of Taiwan, then that would be considered when the U.S. would intervene. And the thing is, that's exactly what China is looking to do. We can say that there's this big ambiguity. Oh, what would China do? But the issue that comes down to is China wants Taiwan. They don't want the islands around it. They don't want the airspace above it. They want Taiwan, and they see it as integral to their identity. So I really think this concern, well articulated, is not as important. And very briefly on the former part of your question, is you say that Mr. Simmons and I both seek to exit strategic ambiguity. But what was proposed by Mr. Simmons is merely stronger rhetoric. The problem with strategic ambiguity is that we are not telling China that we will defend Taiwan. Until we do so, China is going to continue to send planes over there and testing the boundaries. I'm very briefly going to tell two quick stories that demonstrate this beautifully. In 2013, China says if America sends ships or planes over this contested land of Japan, we will consider it an act of war. What did Obama do? He sent 2 B-52s over the airspace and not a word was heard. The second story is actually why we're all up here right now, and it's because of what happened in Afghanistan. It was after Afghanistan that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party felt emboldened. Why? Because they saw a weak America. It was after that they started breaking more and more records with more involvement in Taiwan. If we are firm, we can check China. Without that military firmness, there is nothing we can do.
I think it's very easy to propose ends without talking about the means. And in this case, the end of defending Taiwan is not just as simple as sending a couple planes over to Japan. We currently have planes, I don't know if Mr. Knox is aware of this, in Okinawa, which is quite closer to Taiwan than Japan is. But the problem is, bluffs are dangerous. And bluffs are pledging to do something and then not knowing how you're going to carry it out or why. And the issue with this is that right now, Mr. Knox can talk about the weather and the islands, but see, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, they're not dumb. They run what's called war games. They run scenarios where they look at how would an invasion of Taiwan look like. And the 2001 National War College considered this very point. They said Westerners assume there's going to be this massive immediate invasion. But see, assuming that maritime invasion just occurs rapidly, it misses Mr. Knox's opening point, which is China doesn't play by those rules. China doesn't play by the fast attack. They play by the slow 100-year marathon. And the National War College looked at what happens if they take initially smaller islands that are closer, where there are Taiwanese troops currently. And the question is, would we go to war then? And that matters a whole lot. Because you see, China's pushing right now. And the second you define it, they're going to push even more. Why? Because they can get very close to that line, especially when it's not clear. If the clear line is the end invasion of Taiwan, then China will spend 100 years getting every single aspect around Taiwan that they can. They'll blockade it, which they currently have the naval capacity to do. Will we go to war for that? What if they sabotage the chip plants, as I mentioned earlier? And finally, on the point of the weather, I think this showcases the lack of the ability to often perceive how ambiguity and how specific nuances are resolved. The National War College addressed this point in their 2001 analysis. They said the Chinese would also have to contend with 2 monsoon seasons, from August to September and from November to April, and be restricted to 2 windows of attack, from May to July and the month of October. Still, such impediments did not thwart U.S. amphibious forces at Incheon during the Korean War, nor did coral reefs and extremely low tide prevent the seizure of Taiwan in World War II. And they concluded that that point ultimately did not stand in relation to China's ability to take over Taiwan.
Response.
So with these war games and these models, it's important to understand actually how they work. So they're merely a set of algorithms, and what you put into them is what you end up getting out of them, right? So if you make a set of assumptions about how this would go, then you're going to get a certain end of result. Now it's interesting, because I think Mr. Simmons' use of these algorithms are the greatest attack against his position. You see, the reason Taiwan would get smoked is because we're living in the era of strategic ambiguity, where we aren't taking steps. But what happens when we run back the war games and we change some of the assumptions? What happens if we make changes to put subs in the area? What happens, because he pointed out correctly that we do have F-22s in Okinawa. The issue is they're not there all the time, and there's a finite amount of F-22s. What I'm proposing is a shift in the way that we understand our threats. No longer is the threat in the Middle East, the threat is in China. And we're starting to see the American populace realize this, but by making certain changes, we actually change the input, and the war models would come out entirely different with set assumptions.
A brief response, then we'll move to a
Two
different
things.
question.
One, I don't think the way you awaken the American people or help awaken their realization of something is by saying you're going to declare war. I think that's foolish and imprudential in every sense of the word. However, secondly, on the question of missing things in it, I think it's interesting because the U.S. Air Force ran a war game with this exact scenario recently. They said, what if the U.S. was there? And the U.S. did respond in every single way. And you know what they ran it on? They didn't even run it on a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. They looked at one of those almost uninvadable islands. And you know what they found? The U.S. barely held out. The U.S. did help. But you know how they did that? By having 3 technologies that are not even in production yet, including ammo supply ships planes that do not exist, a new advanced fighter jet that is only one currently made in production to test even. And so they have run war games on this. I think it's interesting to say that the U.S. military would definitely be able to withstand this attack and would know how to do it well, and that we have all this information, but then to dismiss the many war games that they run. And finally, on this point, I think it was summed up quite well by the Lieutenant General for Strategy for the Air Force, who said the definitive answer of these war games is if the U.S. does not change course immediately, not change course in just pledging support, but rather change course in also in a 100-year marathon, a development of resources, not empty pledges of military support, we're going to lose quite fast.
So looking at the different inputs that go into these algorithms and these war games that both of you are discussing, in light of the recent U.S. humiliation with the Afghanistan situation, do you think that it now becomes a necessity for the U.S. to prove itself to its allies around the world? This is for you, Mr. Simmons, yes.
I think it very much is, and I think that's why it ought to be strategic coherence. I'm not postulating that we ought to continue with strategic ambiguity, because right now we're quite ambiguous. This is why Biden a couple weeks ago came out and said that we would defend Taiwan, and then immediately his press releases and the entire White House put out all these memos against it. That's strategic ambiguity. No one knows what the heck we're even thinking about. But strategic coherence says, yes, China is a threat. Yes, Taiwan is a friend of the United States. And yes, we will arm them. Yes, we will help develop economic sanctions that do actually cripple China. But see, the problem with all of those is even in accepting economic sanctions, the American people have to be willing to do it. And if the American people currently are not willing to accept a hit on their bank account due to tariffs, they're sure not willing to sacrifice their sons and daughters.
Mr. Knox.
I try the best that I can to not speak in platitudes, but strategic coherence is a distinction without a difference. In the absence of pledging military support, we are not leaving the phase of ambiguity that we're in. Merely saying that we're going to sanction China stops absolutely nothing. Their economy, an export-based economy, is moving away from the United States. We don't carry the force that we once did, which is why we need to understand the most important geopolitical concept that defines the post-Cold War era. Integrated deterrence. Integrated deterrence, that is. What integrated deterrence is, it's when the United States acts with the coherence of other nations. And it's when the United States allies itself with other nations, and I think this is part of the analysis that is missing in our entire discussion of this. If the United States says we will support Taiwan if they are attacked, watch what happens to the anti-Chinese sentiment that is brewing around that region. Japan is a nation that has never started militarizing at the rate that it is today. Vietnam should not hate China and should not be loving us. The Philippines, who should be snuggling up to China right now, should not be moving closer to the United States. People in that region are recognizing what is going on. And I think that we're missing out on the opportunities for leadership that can happen right there.
Well, I think the first point on this is with Japan, yes, Japan did not, their constitution actually outlawed having any military up until a couple years ago. And yes, they are working further with us as allies. Philippines, their number one source of foreign aid currently is China. They are not going to move against them in any serious fashion other than in rhetoric or signing ambiguous treaties unless it actually push comes to shove. And this is the thing. The strategic ambiguity is currently us having no idea where we stand in relation to China and Taiwan other than we're somewhat friendly to them. What I am proposing is that we clarify China is an enemy, China is a threat, they are fighting the 100-year marathon. We say that Taiwan is a friend. Taiwan is a country that we ought to help develop through providing military support, through bolstering them economically. That is not a trite distinction. That is serious. That is grave because the U.S. is truly still the premier superpower. It truly is. And when it speaks, nations listen. They do. And this idea that somehow only through pledging to send excessive amounts of military force presently to Taiwan, that is the only response that will actually awaken the American people and start coercing our allies into helping us, is to treat both of those two at a level that ought not to be treated. The American people are and can listen to its leaders, to its statesmen. And the prudential statesman understands that drastic action is not the solution to a lack of a direction that you do not like.
Response and
I'm willing to say that I don't fully understand what strategic coherence is, but as explained in this last response, it seems to very much just be a doctor who's diagnosing an illness, yet refusing the very thing that would save him. Mr. Simmons admits that China is on the 100-year march. He admits that China is encroaching upon Taiwan, yet we have no idea what would leave. Strong rhetoric, sanctions. This was the argument that people said about World War I. Oh, there's no way France and Germany would go to war. Their economies are too intertwined. As soon as France makes an action, Germany's going to back down. No. Because there are forces that precede monetary concern. Honor. We are late-stage democratic men. We don't think too much about honor, but it is honor that is primarily motivating the CCP. And when we're dealing with a nation that is not motivated by primarily economic means, but for honor, we aren't able to just sanction our way out of this one. It's going to take might. It's going to take boldness. And this is the beauty of what I'm trying to explain here, is that that doesn't mean war. It is the presence of showing that you're willing to do so is the very thing that defers us from going to conflict. I think there is simplistic appeal to saying let's not pledge military support, but here's the ramifications, is we are either going to pledge military support and defend Taiwan here, or we're going to be having the same debate, hopefully not Simmons and I, in another 20 years. And in that, because you want to know what China calls Taiwan? The unsinkable aircraft. Because they understand that when they get Taiwan, they can pivot to wherever they want in that region. Either we check China with military means alone right here, or we are left with no ammunition to fight this going forward.
we'll give you an opportunity for a response, and we'll move to our final question and then questions from the audience.
I think it's important to hit upon one key point of what Mr. Knox said at the end. He said we're going to respond with military means, and he chastises the position of strategic coherence as being one that is vague. But notice what's interesting about his position. His position is that we pledge military support. His only action that he's proposed tonight? Sending F-22s to Japan. So the idea that somehow strategic coherence leaves us unbridled from actual action hides the fact that the position of simply saying we will defend Taiwan without taking serious the multiplicity of war games that say we're going to lose Taiwan, the many lieutenant colonels and generals in the military that currently are warning that China can and will beat us in a battle for Taiwan, is simply rhetoric. It is easy to do that. There's a simplistic appeal, I agree, to saying we don't want war. And I'm trying my best not to do that tonight. But I think it's also important to not just try the trite appeal to that we should militarily defend them. Because that, without any sort of nuance in action other than sending some planes to Japan, is just as bad. But see, it's worse. Because the consequences of pledging military support, that's actual lives on the line. There's actual battle that we would fight and lose. And that's serious. That's not something you can dismiss easily by saying that the American people value honor.
So the final question that we have here tonight, and we've danced around this topic a little bit, and I think, Mr. Knox, you talked about the concept of bilateralism in the post-Cold War era and what that would look like, practically speaking, if the United States, perhaps NATO allies, were actually going to support Taiwan militarily. So the question is, and the term United States potentially could, in your response, include the bilateralism you've been referring to. But would the United States win an armed conflict over Taiwan with China? And if not, wouldn't a military loss to China be a clear sign of defeat on the world stage?
Mike Milley is the director of the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff. He was asked this very question. His response? No. He knew that we could take Taiwan. He knew that it is plausible, but he knew we could do it if. This is possible if we pledge support and take the necessary steps to do so. I think Mr. Simmons makes a fair point here. I am in no way to have access to the classified material that would allow me to say specifically how many, who, what, where is going to Taiwan, but I also think that's a very minute point in scale of what we're considering. I fail to see how the number, the way, the manner in which we defend Taiwan matters insofar as we are doing exactly what Mr. Bach just spoke on, acting bilaterally with a cohort of nations, because keep this in mind, the United States is still stronger than China right now. The United States and its allies are still stronger than China right now. But if Taiwan gets invaded, We don't respond militarily. The United States loses all face on the international scale. The international bodies which ought to regulate China have been devalued and have lost all their legitimacy. Then what will we have? I shudder to think of what those war game models will tell us. Because the whole problem with the war game models is we're so entrenched in the Enlightenment that we love these analytical methods that tell us exactly how this would happen. But the reality is that that's all predicated upon your assumptions. And if we merely make new assumptions about strategic positioning, this whole thing changes. The reason the United States would not do well in a conflict right now with Taiwan is a logistical one. All of our troops are where? Here. Where is Taiwan? Over yonder. If we switch that and we go ahead and say we're exiting strategic ambiguity, we would be in a better logistical position to respond to the threat, and we would have help of allies in the region.
Mr. Simmons.
I think firstly it's important to note that, as I point out, the Air Force did run a war game where they did put our troops there. And so this idea that somehow we've never considered what would happen if we sent troops over there is just simply false. Secondly, it's easy to appeal to some idea of the Enlightenment, thinking we can know everything, to state that it is quite clear that there are obvious things we know. I mean, this doesn't seem to be too much of a difficult point. And obviously, the U.S. is rapidly falling behind China in technology and in military strength and capacity. And the question is, how do we best address that? And Mr. Knox is predicating that pledging to militarily defend Taiwan is what brings about that proper response. But rather, see, the error is a step behind that. It's a step behind on the development, the tactics, the strategy. And it is foolish in, I guess, a similar Enlightenment manner to think we know how China is going to carry this out. One massive invasion. Because the absence of a red line is still not answered tonight. Because that doesn't require knowledge of numbers or something. This is a question of what happens if China were to, as the National War College asked in 2001, start to invade the Kinmen County Island, 6 miles from the China mainland. Or then attack the Penghu Islands, 30 miles from the mainland. What would happen then? Because right now the U.S. Air Force ran a strategy on that, or analysis on that, and said we'd lose. And it's fair to say, okay, we don't know what would happen in that situation. But it's also foolish to suggest that we don't need to think about when we are going to actually defend Taiwan by sending our troops into battle over an island 6 miles from China's coast.
May I briefly respond on such matters?
Brief response, and while you do so, Ms. Sims will go to the audience. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and she'll choose 2 individuals to ask questions to our speakers. Mr. Knox.
The answer of the red line has been answered time and time again, not by me, but by the scholars which precede me who have answered this very question. It's an invasion upon mainland Taiwan. Now, what's interesting is Mr. Simmons is searching for a red line in the sand. But what's interesting about this whole thing is that he still has to reckon with this too. If he wants to go with strategic coherence, then where is his red line on where strategic coherence kicks in? This is a misnomer of a conversation to even be having. The question is, if China invades mainland Taiwan, that is the question that the whole international community is rallying behind, which leads me to the second point, and it's exactly what you pointed out, Mr. Bach, is all of the war games that Mr. Simmons has appealed to. When have we factored in the presence of the Quad, the new Trans-Pacific alliance that is forming between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States? As I pointed out in the last question, there is a shift that is occurring as of late, a shift in Southeast Asia, a shift that means that we are going to have the presence of allies where we perhaps would not have had them prior. And I think this shift is something that totally changes the tide of the war because for the mere fact that we, with the presence of our allies, are still stronger than China, but that window may dwindle. If China attacks Taiwan and there is no response, we have no idea the steps they will take after.